MICCR. MICCR is a IES-funded project. Started in 2014. We are in our third year of a three-year $1 million grant, and the intention of our initiative is to build the capacity of districts and communities to engage in evidence-based strategies and improve college and career readiness. Through this work, we've paired national researchers from across the country with school and district leaders situated here in Massachusetts to engage in a three-year project covering such subjects as early college, individualized learning plans, and social-emotional learning. Our principal investigators include Scott Solberg, who is with us today, as well as Jim Foreman, Chad Dontremont, and then close collaboration with the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, Carrie Conaway. Our supporting organizations are also listed there at Boston University, Rennie Center, and Mass Inc., as well as support from the National Collaborative for Workforce and Disability and DESI. With that, I turn it over to Fred.
All right, great. Well, thanks, Livonia. Thanks for everyone joining me and the group here on a Friday afternoon. And thanks to MICCR for their support of this talk and certainly the overall effort in bringing academics together with folks in the district. And it's been a fantastic long-term collaboration that I look forward to continuing. And in that spirit of collaboration and cooperation and communication, if you all have questions during my talk, feel free to ask them. I guess you can do that through this Adobe chat interface. Also, I hope to leave time at the end of my talk or discussion for other points you might want to bring up in terms of practical issues in quantitative analyses. And we already have one question that came in, and I'll address that at the end, and then please offer others as time permits. So as the title slide notes here, we're going to talk a little bit about some quantitative strategies, some practical advice when analyzing data pertaining to college and career readiness. Really, this is some generic advice, I'd say, that applies to many situations, but I'll try to bring up specific research that I do in this domain that might put some important context around it that would help you in your own research in this area. So again, thanks for having me, and we'll charge forward here. So in thinking about what we might talk about today, rather than exploring any particular method in depth, and there are certainly a lot of methodological tools that can be brought to bear in this domain, and again, I'm happy to try and answer or at least discuss specific methods questions. I thought instead we would focus on kind of recurrent practical issues that happen again and again. And I'm guessing if you all were in the room with me, I'd see many people nod their heads in some shared agreement that their experiences have been similar. But I think in some ways it's nice to be able to consolidate or encapsulate these issues and remind ourselves of them time and again, because even though we're all smart people, for sure, right? But sometimes we need those systematic lists of issues just to remind ourselves, kind of like a grocery list and remembering the milk. We want to remember some of these issues we face as researchers. So I enumerated here 8 types of pitfalls that I've encountered in research, and then I also want to discuss how I've tended to address them. Sometimes they're patch jobs like this. Sometimes they're smoother, so you don't even notice. But it does depend. So the first issue I wanted to raise as a pitfall was one that you might have encountered where researchers are interested in a particular phenomenon, and they're torn between using off-the-shelf measures, either commercial measures or measures that appear in the academic literature, so they could grab one of those measures that are readily available, or they could create something on their own. And like I note here, homemade cookies are pretty good. If you're like me, you're salivating a little bit right now after your lunch. But homemade measures, at least when they first come out of the oven, they're not as good to use. I don't want to say they're not as good in terms of quality, and I want to make that important distinction. They could be high quality. The point is that we just don't know when we make up a measure. And the point I want to make here is that if you decide to come up with a measure of your own, that really then entails its own measure development effort. It entails gathering data on reliability and validity, and it may entail an item revision process. It may entail testing the measure on different samples, et cetera, the kind of typical measure development process we use to gain some confidence that the measure is measuring what it should, that the measure generalizes across different settings, and even some of the basics, like making sure the measure is kind of acceptable to folks. We'll cover that in another pitfall here. But the point I want to make is that you know, when there are trade-offs between the measure that's already out there that may not be perfect versus the measure you think will be perfect if you make up the questions, I think I would err on the side of using the existing measure if your goal is to launch right into validity, you know, studying phenomena of interest, implementing an intervention, looking at correlational relationships, et cetera. If you want DVs based on measures that will hopefully answer your research questions, you really need to use an established measure, or if you're going to make one on your own, it needs to go through the rigorous process we would expect from psychological measurement. And that may not be your, like I said, that may not be your goal. Your goal may not be to develop a new measure, or it might be, but that's its own research endeavor, is the point. Okay. Another pitfall is how instructions on I say test here, but I mean any form of assessment where you're administering it in the research context and you're giving participants some framing as they engage in the study. You know, my experience has told me that there's an instinct on the part of researchers to make the instructions very detailed so that participants are not to make any mistakes. That's a good intention. Also to follow some theoretical basis. So, you know, let's say you're measuring goal orientation. You want to kind of explain the purpose, and you go to the literature and you're kind of explaining the theory to get them in the right mindset. That also is done with good intention. But the pitfall is in doing that, sometimes there's a lack of understanding that the folks who are engaged in your assessment, your intervention, have different motives. They may not want to listen attentively to instructions, and therefore they may not respond to them. They also might want to be engaged, but they don't have the technical background that's implied by the level of detail that you give. And the instructions, furthermore, may not even be at their reading level. If you borrow language from an academic context, that may not be appropriate for your your audience. So I developed this pitfall, this slide, because time and time again, I've had a lot of fussy conversations about instructions, and really what has to enter into the conversation is an assumption that whoever is engaged in your research through an experiment or an assessment may not be listening to the instructions or reading the instructions very pilot testing, or they begin the research and there's some fits and starts because of a lack of pilot testing, and then there might be some informal decision, well, these data don't count. Rather than doing that, there should be a more kind of deliberate approach to setting up the research and trying it out, trying out the measures. You develop a study with the best of intentions, but getting everything right initially from a small sample. And by this, I do not mean running initial statistics to see whether findings are going to go in a certain direction. I absolutely do not mean that. What I mean is more operational. So not even necessarily collecting data, but just making sure folks can read the measures or they can engage in the experiment appropriately. You get them perhaps to report on their own experience to ensure that the steps of the procedure went the way you thought, to ensure that folks participating feel like it was, comfortable, certainly fair. Like, if test items can get reviewed for questions being invasive or otherwise awkward, is it easy to engage in the study? Is the measure easy to take? Is everything timed appropriately? Are there any hitches that force some delays that might be prevented, or maybe they're necessary delays that you didn't factor into the research, and so you need to be more kind of re-estimate what your budgeted time is every time you run a study. And it gives you then a sense, pilot testing gives you a sense of how administration is really going to be carried out and what the time and labor costs are and so on. Another reason to pilot test is sometimes underappreciated. It might be well appreciated by this group, and that's to get institutional buy-in. In other words, getting your ducks lined up in terms of folks you're interacting with and saying, hey, can you, we need to try this out. I want it to work for you all. So it communicates your willingness. You don't just want to conduct the research, you want to do it right. And selfishly, that means good data, but unselfishly, it means that your folks are going to have a good experience and therefore will want to participate in the research again. And, sometimes in my experience, there are some tasks where I want them to review material in part to get the feedback, but the side benefit is there's they're committing just really a small sliver of time, but just enough to say, hey, we're still here, we're preparing for the study, and that matters in terms of just making sure that there's still a pulse on both ends as a study gets moving. So I think that sort of cultural institutional buy-in as using pilot testing as one instance of reinforcing that buy-in is important. Fourth pitfall is moving into more technical issues is when you develop a measure and there are items sometimes that are coded in the opposite direction. So if you have an item on a Likert scale, you say respond 1 to 5, I tend to be a messy person. And if that's supposed to be a measure of conscientiousness, well, being messy is not conscientious, so you'd have to reverse the scoring, sort of in the way the graphic shows here. That's fine. What often happens, or what's happened to me across multiple contexts in educational assessment is, several things. So one is people forget to reverse code. Another is where people do reverse code, but then they then they reverse code again, and they coded into the same item. So they didn't create a new item that was reversed. They just ran a syntax file and reversed the code back into itself. So they didn't realize that they ran the code twice and ended up where they started. So that's obviously a problem. A solution to that is a good habit to get into, which is when you reverse code, create a new item. Say you append the item name with the letter R to indicate reversing. Because that way, if you were to run the code again from the original data, you would always get the new reverse coded item with R. You could run it as often as you want, and you would never make a mistake. So I bring that up as a pitfall because maybe because of me, but I think it's more of a common problem where we lose track of how we reverse coded, and also I bring up the D value issue. That's a little bit different where the coding doesn't pertain to items, but instead to people. I guess I shouldn't even call it reverse coding, but I'll bring this up as a related issue. You know, a D value is a standardized mean between groups, and you need to pay attention to what the direction is for the groups. So traditionally, it's the group you're interested in, like say you're comparing minorities to a majority group. You would take the minority mean minus the majority mean divided by the pooled standard deviation, and that would be a D value. You have to be consistent then and make sure that that is the direction. It's always minority minus majority. So when everybody, if you're convening with people and they say, yeah, we computed D values, you want to make sure that they did it the same way you did so that the numbers you're talking about are actually comparable. They're not flipped. So that's, perhaps I could have separated that into a separate pitfall. The reason I didn't is from one nightmarish experience I had where we had to deal with a reverse coding issue at the item level, and we weren't sure which groups, what the order was for groups being compared in terms of D values that were based on that item. So you can imagine the problems you have where you're not sure which items were reverse coded and you're not sure which groups were compared, what the order was. And putting those two together led to some real headaches. It also, fortunately, led to some new habits where our team said, okay, consistently, we're reverse coding into new items. Consistently, D values have to do with the group you're interested in minus the reference group, the focal group minus the reference group. So I'm halfway through my pitfalls here. Are there any questions you want to ask up to this point or any experiences you want to share around these issues? Is there some simpatico around these issues? You've experienced these?
Yeah, this is Scott. You know, some of the details, certainly the reverse coding, we always have to be careful on. And we're always, when we would do it, we would recode the item's title to make sure that it was done and you could find it as opposed to just putting it in. The other issue, pitfall, that you haven't mentioned, maybe it's coming down the lane, is when you're combining items, I've had my students combine, add the items together and divide it by the number of items to come up with an average, or taking the full sum, and basically needing to remind them that we need to take the non-missing values so that we have so that the average is actually based on the number of items that were completed, not on the total number of possible items. Right. That's just something I've had major problems with in the past when that wasn't done correctly. The data comes out quite funny. So,
right. I didn't pay you for that, and it is coming up.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. So definitely. I'll tell you another experience I've had with students on this particular issue. I'll have a student say, Fred, I've got this 15-item scale, and alpha is, the alpha reliability is 0.23. And I can say there are very few things I can say in life with confidence, but one thing I can say with confidence there is the student forgot to reverse code some of the items. And sure enough, in every case I've had about 3 or 4 cases, but in every case they come back and alpha then ends up being 0.8 or 0.9 because this was the underlying issue, in fact. So here is Scott's issue. Actually, I think I did it in 2 places, but I'll deal with it here. It's down there in the footnote. So treating missing data. There are a variety of ways to do this. There are some fancy ways. There are some straightforward ways. There are ways we know we should not treat missing data. Basically, never use pairwise case deletions. So, only like a correlation matrix, you only delete cases if the pair of numbers if one of a pair of numbers is missing, you delete that pair. That's bad practice. Listwise, where you delete an entire case if they're missing any data, that might, I say don't use it here in the slide, that might be permissible if you had a really small number, and even then, of course, report any decision you make like that. But say you had 3,000 subjects and you had 3 cases where there was missing data, I think you would be forgiven if you omitted those 3 cases and reported the fact that you did that, and maybe report the type of missingness you had there. But generally, if you have lots of missing data, list-wise is bad because you're eliminating, you're getting rid of information, right? You're getting rid of subjects that are providing lots of data potentially that inform the research, but you're eliminating them because some of the data in there is missing. So that's pretty bad. The 2 kind of acceptable methods, I don't have time to get into the details, but there's full information maximum likelihood, which is kind of a one-shot kind of model estimation approach to getting the parameter estimates right in a model. And then there's multiple imputation, where you kind of estimate missing values multiple times and then get an average of model estimates across those data sets where you estimated. So those approaches are acceptable, and that's the route you should go. Or from a practical point of view, related to Scott's point, you can take a given scale and you say, look, if I have 10 items, if a person responded to 80% of them, then take their average. So if they responded to 8 items, you add it up and divide by 8. If they responded to 9 items, you add up those scores and divide by 9. There's an SPSS command for that. For those who use SPSS, if you take the mean function, mean and then parentheses and the variables, it'll then average only those items that were responded to. Furthermore, if you want to screen it and say, only give me the mean if there's an 80% response rate, then you can do, I think it's mean 0.80, and then in parentheses, you list the variables separated by commas, and then assign all that to a mean value, whatever you want to call the score, and that gets you a score on that scale. So that's a very practical approach, a very useful approach, taking the averages, and if you want to get a score for each individual, that's the way to go. The FIML, the FIML, full information maximum likelihood, and multiple imputation methods, that's not about estimating individual scores. That's about estimating parameters of a model, like a structural model or a regression model. So that's different. Estimating the slopes or factor loadings, et cetera, is different from estimating individual scores. So those approaches are acceptable, but don't just delete data because it's missing. A 6th pitfall deals with ignoring the means in correlational research. So I had a student, actually this was in the organizational context, but it applies to the classroom as well. Student was measuring creativity in a study where there was a creativity manipulation. So there were 4 different situations that manipulate creativity. Students rated the creativity of the situation, and then there was some performance outcome. And basically, let's say that in one of the situations you had something like you see here in terms of the scatter plot. That's fine to report a positive correlation, and it's great to show the scatter of the data. The issue here, though, was the data in each situation kind of looked like what you see here. These aren't the actual data, but it kind of looked like what you see here, where you have a positive relationship, but on the x-axis you can see that if the x-axis, say, was showing the 1 to 5 scale that you see on the left, then you can see that the average for creativity was on the low side, right? It was below 3. It was below the midpoint even. And the midpoint is kind of a psychological boundary, right? If you're asked how creative a situation is and you're willing to answer below the midpoint, that means it wasn't a very creative situation. By the way, the student still had a great project, but the advice that was given by multiple folks working with him was, we need to think about situations that actually are creative. And the point here is that the original approach was to focus on the correlations. Creativity predicts performance. Look, there's positive correlations. That's a nice story, and it's a true story, but if you don't look at the means, you're not getting the full story, right? You're not getting the influence of the situation. And I don't think in this study the student wanted to say that this only pertains to low creativity situations. They actually wanted a range of situations. So paying attention to the means is really important, and you can apply this to other constructs as well. You're looking at student satisfaction in the schools, and you're looking at correlations. Well, it helps to look at the means, and if the mean is below, a 3 on a 1 to 5 scale or a 4 on a 1 to 7 scale, that tells you plenty of students were willing to answer below the midpoint, which is telling and good to know. Okay. The 7th pitfall, this is probably my most technical point, and I'll be quick about it, is that for folks who run confirmatory factor analysis or structural equation models, you know that the software output will give you what's called model modification indices. That's what MMI is at the bottom of the slide. Model modification indices tell you how to change the model to make it fit your data better. That's fine, and often researchers will go ahead and make the changes that are recommended. They rerun the model, and it's no surprise then that the model fits the data better, because that's exactly what you were told. Basically, if you run the model on the same data making these changes, it's going to fit better. The problem is that when you make something fit better on the same data, that's no guarantee that it's going to fit better on new data. And in fact, it might fit worse because you customized the glove. That's the picture on the left on the slide. You made a custom glove that fits to your data, but it may not fit. That custom glove may be very painful on a new data set, on a new hand, right? So continuing the glove analogy, what you want when you fit models, you don't want gloves that fit. If a glove is a model and your hand is the data, you don't want a glove that fits any particular hand too tightly because it'll hurt all the other hands. On the other hand, you don't want a glove that has no functionality, which is on the right. That'd be called a mitten. It does keep you warm. It's functional that way, but you can't grip anything very well. And so you could create a model that's pretty sloppy and fits most data sets, but doesn't do the best job of fitting. So if that makes sense, you want a model that is not too tight, the custom glove. You don't want that's too loose. You want one that's just right, that's robust, and actually fits across different data sets. So when you hear stuff about cross-validation, what they're saying is take the parameters, take the glove that you created in one model, which can be based on model modification indices or anything else you want to do. You can do as much monkeying around as you want on a data set in creating a good fitting model, as long as, and that should be underlined, as long as you fit that model to a new data set without monkeying around. Then you have evidence for robustness. So that's what cross-validation is about, or you hear fancy words like K-fold cross-validation, or in regression, sometimes you hear about correction for shrinkage. All of that is about trying to get at more robust estimates for a model. Usually they're more conservative estimates. They're more conservative than maybe what you started with, but they're also more robust because they'll hold up in other samples. So that's advice for one additional technical comment is for those who do this modeling is some of the modification advice might be to do correlated errors, right? So you correlate the errors, you get better model fit. The problem is there was no theoretical reason to correlate those errors. Sometimes there is an a priori way to do it where you say, before you even run the models, you say, hey, these items look alike. I mean, the content is so specific, there has to be something related between them that is above and beyond the factor, like just the fact that the specific content. Like if I was measuring extroversion and one item said, I like to take a shower, and another item said, I like to get up in the morning really quickly and get ready and go. Maybe those items are similar because they deal with morning activities above and beyond extroversion. So you might make those errors correlate. Another more obvious example is when you give a measure over time, then you want the constructs to correlate over time, but then you want matching items to correlate over time as well. So item 7 at time 1 may well be correlated with item 7 at time 2 because it has the same content, and it might be correlated above and beyond what the construct suggests. So you'd want matching items to have their errors correlate. So it's a little bit of a tangent there, but if you do that sort of modeling, I'm happy to talk with you further about model modification. And hopefully you get the general spirit of the message that if you tweak your model on the same data, yeah, it's going to be improved, but you need to show that it works in new data. And now the 8th and final pitfall here that I have for you is when there's a lack of documentation. We're clearly in an open science movement above and beyond any specific replication issue or replication crisis. Our goal as in our disciplines and in our journals is to be more open, transparent, more informative, well beyond replicate. You may want to replicate someone's findings, but really the goal of providing information be transparent so that anyone can look at it and see what you did. But selfishly, in my experience working, I had a project with the College Board where we did research over 6 years on various data sets, and we had to document extensively to remind our future selves, if anything, because we get forgetful and what did that variable mean, and what if someone new joins your team? They need to know what's going on, and beyond meeting them and doing a data dump of the kind of idiosyncratic knowledge in your head, it's good to have that documentation out there. So getting yourself and your team members in the habit of some, pretty maybe more extensive documentation than is you think is natural or that you'd want to do. I think you'll thank yourself later, especially as your projects and your teams get bigger. Have code books. Variable names should be transparent, or there should be description with them. Sometimes it's nice to put either the item number or the page number next to the variable name. So if you have a paper version, you might put the page number so that they can locate where that variable is, or put the item number on a numbered test. Anything that gets you in gear, so that if you often have to multitask in life, and when you return to a project, you want to re-engage as quickly as possible. So your team will thank you for it, and you might thank yourself for it as well. So that's the end of my pitfalls and basically the end of my talk. I give you some useful general references on measurement. I think they're these are very solid sources in my opinion. I refer to them a lot, and even if you have a lot of experience in measurement, like I said at the beginning of this talk, it's sometimes useful to remember the groceries you need to go out and get, and the same thing for measurement. It's useful to remind yourselves of the basic principles of measurement and assessment in light of your college and career readiness research, and also these books, like the DeVellis book, also keeps its eye on the future. But I chose references intentionally that lean more on the fundamentals that don't go away in measurement, but there's certainly, there's always new methods of design and measurement that pushes us forward as a field, and I'm happy to talk about that as well if you're interested in kind of those broader issues around measurement. So thanks a lot. I really appreciate it, and we're all in the family together, so contact me anytime. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Fred, for the presentation. I know that we had a couple of questions in our chat box, as well as one that came in a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
So maybe if we can start with the larger one in terms of how you can manage data from very large data sets like the National Clearinghouse, how we can do measurements on those. Just talk a little bit about your experience with it, Fred.
Sure. Well, for clearinghouse data in particular, I do have some experience. It's relatively limited, and maybe folks attending today have a broader experience. Most recently, I have a project with ACT, the testing company, where we're looking at predictors of choice of college major and dropout, or conversely persistence, if you want to look at it that way. And the clearinghouse data gives us information, in terms of student enrollment. Where were they? What college did they go to? In what semester? Did they transfer? Did they drop out? Did they drop back in potentially? And so you do get, there's at least. So we worked with ACT to get these data, and my understanding is you pay for the extent of the data that you want. The more you want in terms of what's available, the more you pay. But in terms of the breadth of what the clearinghouse offers, that's where I lack the experience. In terms of large data sets, I would say that in terms of the analysis issues, I found it to be it's really useful to be comfortable shifting between software programs, partly because each program offers different features that make things, sometimes something's easy just to open it in Excel and do something with it, to look at it. Or sometimes it's easier just to do it to open it in SPSS. So what I tend to do is, save the file in a simple format, like a text file, tab-delimited text file, so that I can open it in anything and move back and forth. Another reason to be adept in multiple platforms is to go with your own knowledge. So, it could be true that one program does it all, but often we have knowledge in different areas of different software programs, and there's always a trade-off in life between, moving forward on your project and just getting through and shifting between programs versus spending time and learning a new program. Learning R, for example, is like learning the internet. You can't. You can learn different packages, you can learn the basics, but it's good to shift between those things that when you manage large data sets. So I don't know if that answers the question entirely, but I'm happy to talk further or take an email, et cetera.
So I just want to take this moment and acknowledge there are a couple of folks who are on the phone, but we can't see on the computer. So if you do have phone access and you have questions, feel free to unmute yourself now and raise those questions. We're really moving into a discussion and chat format. We also have our PIs here who are available as well to weigh in, and also I encourage you to prompt with questions. So I'm just going to leave with one more question, and then I encourage you all to jump in. We've actually had a question that's on the opposite side, so not large data sets, but relatively small data sets. Can you talk a little bit about how we should approach those? We've got communities who are doing pilot studies with sample sizes as small as 30 or 40 or upwards of 400. So we're talking, relatively modest sample sizes. So what can we do to manage power as well as just interact with those samples in general?
Yeah, well, I think in asking the question, we know what the issues are statistically. The question arises because almost anything we estimate can be pretty inaccurate, apart from maybe a mean. Certainly, as you go into correlations, an N of 30 may not be as accurate as you might like, or give you enough power to detect statistical significance, let alone the accuracy. Just knowing whether it's not zero can be difficult. So, but actually the benefit of small samples is that I think sometimes when we have large samples, we're so into the data and everything can be kind of analyzed with complex methods, and I'm not saying this always happens, but we might, by being quantitatively focused, we might forget the qualitative aspects. And I know this talk was about quantitative pitfalls. Maybe one of the pitfalls is we ignore qualitative information that enhances our understanding of data. So if I have a small data set, it makes it more obvious that I need to know my data well. I need to know my people well, my settings well. I need to know what's being measured. I need to approach the data from a more descriptive sense than an inferential sense. So in other words, it might be that, putting the statistics aside, can I generalize these 30 kids or this classroom at 30, maybe you have teacher ratings, can I generalize that to the classroom next door? Maybe not, but does that mean you can't learn something from that classroom? Of course not. You can learn from that data, and the knowledge that you have to put around that doesn't come from additional data. You don't have it. It has to come from your understanding of the situation. It has to come contextually. It has to come from what you know about educational research. And that's not to say, I'm not saying read too much into the data with external information. The statistics are real. They're unforgiving in terms of error estimates. But I'm just saying, like, we can still look at distributions of data, your descriptive statistics, your means, your standard deviations, and your distributions, and any qualitative information you gather from students and your own understanding of the situation. qualitative information from teachers and districts. That can put a wrapper around those data so that it gives it more meaning, it kind of comes alive more in a sense. And it might, to the extent you can push on that, it might, you can tie that then to the need to collect additional data. You can say, look what we found here. Sometimes the external partners need to be educated with what data has to be collected to get at sounder inferences. They may not know, just like we didn't know entering grad school, how much power was needed for particular analyses to answer certain questions. So that might come before you run the study, but it could also come after as part of a continuing conversation about what needs to be done.
That sounds great, Fred. Another question or another issue that comes to mind, and I've got this, I think, with one of the districts that we're working with right now, is, they want to do their own survey, or they want to take parts of a survey. And in as much as, we can sit in our perspective and say, oh, you don't want to do that, you want to do something valid and all this, it's really about their own development in terms of their learning how to see this and how to make sense of it. And for most of them, they're not interested in a valid scale. They're interested in what individual items are going to share at the end of the day. So they're just kind of looking at the temperature gauge. So right. It's an interesting quandary, but also, I think it takes some time to kind of build their capacity to see what they can do with the data they collect, and then begin moving from there to what a more rigorous strategy might look like in their next run. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up. It's a really interesting issue that I encounter a lot, which is they're not wrong. So they may have specific dials they're looking at that, they need to know these things for institutional purposes, or they have a very specific kind of direct question. I don't know, let's say you're looking at student well-being, and you want to know something about their, are they going to lunch, or what are they having for lunch? And that's a small part of well-being, but it's a very specific thing that can be, that's information that can be targeted for intervention and something you can learn about. There's no construct there. There's no psychological lunch construct necessarily. It's just that one item. And, we can get a lot out of one items in attitudes. Do you like your teacher? It doesn't mean you won't get more information from more items, but if you don't have much time at all and you want to get a snapshot of attitude, maybe that's what you can do, and you can then learn from that. I mean, another thing about single items that kind of it makes the measurement more reliable is that the target of a specific item, like let's say you're asking students about a teacher, well, the number of ratings then you have is the number of students. It's not like the teacher is answering the item and you only have one data point. You actually have data points from all the students that are rating that teacher. So it's actually pretty reliable. But you have to get at it not through traditional psychological measurement. You have to get it more through its correlations and mean differences with other classrooms and so on. So there is a measurement model lurking behind these specific items that you can get at, but I agree it's not the same, and sometimes you need a conversation around your item is too quirky. Let's get at the purpose, and maybe we have to live with it. But maybe there's a better way for measuring that we can talk about as an option. Yeah, it's a good point.
So Reyes has posed two questions as well.
Okay.
The first question, he was asking, in a prompt that has two components, is it best to have one question, or should this be separated in two? So the example is, advisory helps me build a relationship and build connections between my peers and me, should that be separated because of the and? And then also along that line of thought, in the Likert survey where there are themes, should the open-ended qualitative questions come at the end? Should it just be a box at the end of the survey, or is it best practice to include the open-ended question after each item or theme?
Okay. Well, I think the first question is has a pretty direct answer, and the second question is people can maybe have different opinions. It depends on the context. So questions generally should be as pure, I put quotes around that, pure and direct as possible. So if you have, two parts, you want to separate because you don't know whether an answer someone gives is due to one part, the other part, or both parts. So these are so-called double-barreled questions, and the kind of received wisdom is don't ask double-barreled questions because you don't know. Sort of like the courtroom question, where were you when you murdered your wife? It's like, well, I didn't murder my wife. So it's a double-barreled question because you can't really answer the question you can't just say yes or no or one answer. You have to explain it. So separating is better generally, although maybe there are some exceptions. If you have specific examples, I'm happy to talk about it. On the second question, my leaning would be to ask open-ended questions at the end of a survey, and that's sort of answering the notion or addressing the notion of standardization. You kind of want everyone to go through the same experience, and certainly people go into a test with different, diverse array of backgrounds, experiences. They think about questions differently. So those things are, I acknowledge, I'm sensitive to that. But in terms of the structure of a test, we still want to, I think we would want to ask the structured questions first, and not let the open-ended responses, which can differ, not let those influence subsequent questions. So put them at the end. Again, if there, maybe there are exceptions to every rule, I'm happy to discuss, but I would say generally put it at the end. And then there are other interesting questions about when to ask open-ended versus structured questions. And that goes into, the pluses and minuses of standardized testing, how quantitative and qualitative information complement each other, and so on. But that's for another day, perhaps, or after happy hour.
Great. I want to open the floor for any last-minute questions that folks may have. Just offer about 30 seconds or so. Well, I just want to thank you all.
Well,
thank you, Fred, for being with us and presenting today, as well as everyone for joining the talk. Our next forum will be in February, and it is likely, as we're talking about, to expand on research strategies through mixed methods. So we'll send out more information. I've also just put a link in the chat box for just a quick survey on this webinar and giving us a little bit of feedback. But we wanted to just thank you for your time and for your participation. Feel free to reach out to us, myself, as well as any of the PIs, and Fred has also included his information with any further questions from this presentation. Have a great afternoon.
Great. Right. Thanks, Livonia.
Okay,
thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Fred.
Great time. And more importantly, I hope folks learned something. Take care.
Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you, Fred.